Hi Kathy, it's Fabi. Looking at your design that you have been struggling with for the last several days, actually more than just the last several days. I'm really glad that you sent us a picture of the actual stitch out. Maybe since you've sent this one, you've had a little bit better success with successive versions that you've done on this. But for now, let me just make some comments based on the design that you sent to me as well as the actual stitch out. So the first thing that I'm going to start suggesting is about the actual stitch out. And before I start looking at your actual objects and that sort of thing. So I'm really glad you sent this picture because it's giving me a really clear view of some of the reasons why you're not getting a good stitch result here. First of all, you've got your marine vinyl tacked down onto your hoop stabilizer. I can't tell what kind of stabilizer you've got in the hoop, but my suggestion would be that you use a medium or even heavyweight cutaway in the hoop. On our Janome machines, you can use the little magnets that will help to hold that stabilizer inside the hoop without stretching it, so I would suggest doing that. And then the next thing is you need to really secure this vinyl down well on your stabilizer. I can see that that has not been done because I can see all of these bubbles. There's a couple of reasons why that's happening. One of them is because this is not stuck down onto the stabilizer enough. My suggestion is to use a lot of 505 or other spray adhesive type of sticky stuff to get this to stick down well onto that stabilizer. Use a lot of it. You really want this stuck down onto the stabilizer, okay? You could even use a glue stick possibly to get this to stick down really well. And I mean really stick it down good so that you don't get all these bubbles happening. The next thing is, and I'm now going to run on over, excuse me about that, I wasn't watching my screen and see that pop-up came up, is that you have used 3 lines of stitching in order to get your vinyl down onto your stabilizer, which is a great idea. I don't know why you've got 3 lines, but I'm sure you've got a reason for that. But you know, when I look at your basting lines over here, you've kind of got them in the wrong order. How else would I better say that? Okay, so here they are in the list of stuff. The first one that's stitching out is the one that's the furthest out from the center of the hoop. And then your second one is the one that's in the middle, and your last one is the one towards the center. Reverse those. Have them be the very first one is the one that's the closest into the design, and then continuing on outward. Why? Because that, again, is going to help stick this vinyl down onto your stabilizer and keep it from getting some of that bubbling. All right, so reverse the order of those. The next thing is, let's take a look at the rest of your stitch order. All right, so what I can see now is that you're stitching all of the little red parallelograms, and then it goes on to do all of the navy blue ones. And then it continues on doing the lettering and all the other decorations are in the center of the design. Again, I would use some resequencing of all of these objects, and I would stitch from the center out. This is always a good practice to help try to avoid some of the compensation issues that might arise later. So stabilizing all of this stuff down onto that stabilizer first before you do all of these borders. All right, so reorganize all of those things. Now, another thing that might is sometimes controversial is what order we stitch things out in. And I know that our founder of our group, Maggie, was really fond of trying to path everything so that, let's say, everything that was in this dark red color would all stitch out at the same color stop. In this case, I would say no. And again, back to, let's stitch all this navy blue that's in the middle. All right, or maybe all the red. Probably in this case it would be the red because you want this blue to overlap on this area where your stamp is at. So stitch out all the red in the center first, then stitch out all your navy blue in the center, then change your threads again, and then continue to do your borders. You might get a better result that way. When I stitch my borders, I always like to think about going from left to right and from top to bottom. Didn't mean to move that. And then on this side here, you know, again, not logical pathing, but usually will end up giving you a little bit better stitch out going from bottom or top to bottom and then from the left to the right on this side. My sewing machines have always done better stitching from left to right and from top to bottom than going bottom toward the top and right toward the left. So maybe your machine might be picky in that sense as well. Keeping that same logic in mind, when it comes to all of these little parallelograms, again, your machine will probably, because you have the same machine I do, may do a little bit better stitching from left to right and from top to bottom, even on all of these little parallelograms. So take a look at those starting and stop points and maybe do some adjusting there. Let's take a look at this one that I just clicked on. Let's hit the Reshape tool. Now this one is starting at the top and ending at the bottom, and I think that could be a good logical thing. This one, however, it's not. This is starting at the top and it's ending at the top. Just kind of take a look at all of them and just see how they have been put together, and maybe doing some, minor adjustments to things like that. One thing that we have already discussed is your stitch angle of your objects. Now, we're looking at this navy blue one right here, and this is the stitch angle, and it's listing it at an 18-degree line. I think I would like that all the way down at a 0, so that this object is stitching back and forth, and these are your pull compensation lines that are going to be maybe a little bit more stable than that being at an angle. Kind of funny that that's out there. All right, let's take a look at the underlay on these objects. This one, for example, first of all, let's take a look at this. Your fill pattern here is a number 1. One of the pieces of advice that I took very much to heart from Maggie was that her preferred tatami fill pattern was number 2. She said that it just seemed to be a little bit smoother, had a bit better result than number 1, which is the default in the program. And I actually have set my template up so that number 2 is actually my default for my tatami fill pattern. And I don't know, maybe it's just because I love Maggie and I admired her, but I really feel like number 2 actually is a better fill pattern. Try switching that over to number 2, okay? Your stitch spacing, when we are in the leather and suede, it does put that up somewhere at about a 0.39 in millimeters. And I even back it all the way up to 0.4. Now think about this. Your average embroidery thread is a 40 weight. And 40 weight also relates directly to millimeters. So a 40 weight thread is actually about a 0.4 millimeter in density or thickness of that thread. So if you want a light fill, you don't want these stitches piling up on top of each other for a couple of reasons. One being that this is vinyl. We've talked about this before. You cannot have too many perforations of the needle in this vinyl without it starting to do some serious damage to the vinyl. Your objects need to be a somewhat light fill. That's also one of the reasons why we've discussed using some colored vinyl topping underneath all of these objects so that you can get a good look of a fill without having to have so many actual layers and density of thread to accomplish that. So spacing, probably not less than 0.38 or 0.39, which is what the leather and suede setting does for you. The next thing is that let's take a look at, again, take a look at those stitch angles, and you probably want them to be down at a 0 so that you get this stitching back and forth evenly and pulling, hopefully evenly, along these stitch penetrations on the right side and the left side of these little parallelograms. Under Stitching tab, we can take a look at the pull compensation. Now, the default on here is 0.20. Maybe that's not enough for all of these pieces. When we look at your stitch out, your top row looks pretty good, as you had it. Your bottom row, as you have stated over and over again, is really crummy. And you're getting all these little curvy shapes in here, which means that's pull compensation. It's pulling in really tightly along this direction here on this bottom row here. So you might want to adjust your pull compensation up it, maybe up to a 0.7 or something. Just play with that a little bit. Again, also along the sides here, you're getting some of that pull compensation problem. Could be the actual objects. And the other thing that it could be is back to the fact that your vinyl is not secured onto your stabilizer well enough. So there's a couple of things there that could be going wrong. All right, let's take a look over at this object here. This red one, this blue one, blue ones over here on the side. You can see that you're actually getting gaps in your objects as they're stitching out. Again, I'm going to blame the lack of security of that vinyl primarily. But again, it could also be, let's take a look at this object. Let's see, I don't want it to be reshaped yet. Let's take a look at it. I'm going to zoom in. This one here we're going to pick on. This is your original, and it is the fill pattern of number 1. Your spacing is a 0.40. Your underlay on this is an edge run first, and then you've got a tatami as your underlay number 2. And this is all according to how the object was originally digitized. So let's take a look at the Reshape tool. Now you're starting down here at the bottom and you're ending up here at the top. So without running a stitch player on it, I'm going to say that that might be part of the problem. My preference would be, again, we were just talking about when you're stitching borders, want them to stitch from top to bottom. So I think we would want the starting point to be here at the top of this object and the ending of it to be down here at the bottom. In other words, reverse from what it actually is right here. Let's take a look at this though under, let's see how it looks when it actually stitches out. This one here, I'm going to hide everything else. Zoom in on it and let's run the stitch player on it. So remember, it's going to be starting down here at the bottom and ending over here according to the starting and stop points. So it's doing that underlay it did first. Now it's doing all of the stitches. So yeah, because of the stitch angles, it's starting, escape, let's take a look at it. This little object over here. So what was happening was that, yes, it did start down at the bottom. It did all of that edge run underlay. Then it did the tatami underlay. And then it did the weave fill going from bottom toward the top. So it wasn't really a bad stitch order, other than I still would reverse it and have it start here and maybe end here if your stitch pattern is still at this angle. My preference would be that the stitch angle would probably be, let's look at the Reshape tool. Where is our stitch angle at? Right here, it's at a 45-degree angle. I think I would back that down to 180 or 0, back to 0. Okay, so my pull is now going to be coming from this side and this side. I thought I had hidden this image a while ago. Why is it showing up again? All right, so that's how I would digitize these. I would use, first of all, number 2 as my fill. I would change that stitch angle so that it's stitching in this direction rather than at funny little angles in this way. My next thing that I would change is another thing I hadn't talked about, but I just thought about now that I'm looking at this screen, is maybe I would put this at a travel on edge for this little object and experiment with that. See how that might change something. Travel on edge basically means that, let's see, I'm going to hide the unselected. So let's see if we remember how the other one stitched out. Let's run the player on it with travel on edge. So it's doing the edge run first, then it's doing a tatami, and now it's doing the back and forth of the weave pattern. That edge run is really going to help to secure that shape, hopefully. Now, this is something I wouldn't like. I would go ahead and I would change that starting and stop point on that one. I don't like the way that it would make that little... I gotta continue to hide that silly thing. Hide that selected one. So that would be another thing to think about. Okay, let's look way over at the same object. Let's take a look at the stitching and look at the underlay. So this is one thing that John Deere says, and I greatly admire his digitizing as well, and he's taught me a lot of things, is that when you have 2 layers of underlay in an object, the default in the program is always going to put the edge run first, and it's going to put the tatami or the zigzag or whatever your other choices might be second. And John Deere always puts the edge run second. So his first layer of underlay is going to be his tatami, and then his second layer of his underlay is going to be his edge run, and he just says that that gives you a better end result. So let's try that, okay? And I don't know, because I haven't looked at this. Let's look at the fill pattern. We're still at a travel on edge. It's funny how this ended up coming out a little bit more dense looking, doesn't it, now that the stitches are going in this direction. So, you know, try some of these things. All right, another thing that I would change on this design is I would break these two into two different objects. And again, the reason why is I would probably have it stitched from top to bottom here. And, you know, maybe if you wanted to keep it as one object, I'd have it start up here at the top or up at this upper corner, probably wouldn't matter, and then end down here at this bottom. This piece here, let's take a look at how you're designed it. It's starting and stopping at the same point up at the top. Could be a problem, maybe not. Experiment with things like this. The smallest details can make a huge difference. All right, so another thing over here in this area, I think this looks super great. I don't have a lot of critique about it other than I did notice that you digitized your letters yourself, I think. You know, without you actually telling me that, I'm just basing it on what they look like over here and how they're all broken apart into separate little pieces. I went ahead and I worked on your design a little bit. And one of the things that I did is for that lettering, I used a built-in font called Run Block. Now, when you type in something for Run Block, you know, it comes in quite a bit larger than what you see here on the screen. And what you see here on the screen is actually quite a bit larger than what you have on your design. So what I want to just mention also is that in the interest of creating a nice looking design, sometimes we don't need to make it so realistic that we lose some of the quality or the emphasis of what something is supposed to be. So on mine, you know, I only played with this just a little bit. I didn't redigitize your little stamp up here other than redoing the lettering of post service. I made it a little bit bigger than on yours. Yours is, you know, significantly more proportional than what mine is on my side. But I think if this was my design, I would make this whole stamp in the upper corner larger than what you've actually got it. Again, it's just about getting stuff onto the screen and letting it look a little bit, maybe a little more, not as realistic, but maybe just a little bit more attractive to the eye. So I would say, let's make that a little bit bigger. You know, just play with some of these things. And where are the circles? Well, here's your circles and stars. I really liked your little stars, by the way. I thought those looked really cute. So let's make that a little bit bigger. You know, just a little bit bigger. And it also might make it stitch out a little bit smoother. Who knows? You know, just play a little bit around with some of these things, Kathy. And let's move post-service kind of into the center of your circle. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly realistic. I have quite a bit of space in between the two words there. So, you know, play around with some of these positions of things. Let's move that down a little. Service, let's move it up and over a little bit. Might even want to make it a little bit smaller or whatever. Your lines, you know, I'm just playing around now and having fun with your creativity. You know, bringing that down a little bit maybe. Yeah, I kind of like all that. And maybe even selecting all those objects that we just did and moving them over a little bit. It looks really good. I like your stamp. I haven't looked at that in detail, but I think it looks really good. The Bon Voyage, you did also mention that you were having some issues with the way this was stitching out. Let's take a quick look at it. Actually, I'm going to go back over to your design and do that. Not that I changed it, but here's the word, the text that you used as script number 1. And maybe, what were your critiques about it? I don't know. Let's take a look. If you don't get such a great, nice stitch out on here, you've got a couple of little blobbies and things like that going on. But did you know that you can do a whole lot of reshaping of these designs by just selecting the object, clicking on the Reshape tool? So one of the things that I think I might want to do is on the Y and on the G, I might want to try to reshape those points a little bit. So select the Y, for example, and then zoom way in on it and click on the wire line of it. And when you click on the wire line, you're going to get all of the points, all the nodes are going to show up, and you can do whatever you want with these nodes at this point. You can make them come further down. You could grab them individually and you could move them further apart or angle them. So just play around with those a little bit. Maybe you just need more spacing in here. Maybe you need a different font. Maybe what you need to do could possibly be, let's just change the stitch spacing on here. So let's take a look at it. It's the script font. The width, we have it at 100%. Your letter spacing is at 0 right now. So maybe you might want to space them out a tiny bit more. See, I'm just clicking this and I'm just stretching it out maybe a little bit more. Maybe that would give you a better look for driving at what you're looking for. So what I guess I want to say about this is your design is super cute. I just think it's a great idea. And I think your client that you're making it for is going to be very pleased with your end result. But, just take a look at some of the fine details of things. I didn't look at these here in your during this video. But another thing, again, is starting and stop points and underlays. So even on these satin stitch lines, you've got it right now at an auto spacing. The width of this line is 2. You don't need to have the split on for that. But let's take a look at your underlay. You've got an edge run going on here. I think if this was mine, my first underlay on this would be a center run. And then maybe an underlay of an edge run. Maybe not. I don't know. This is, again, one of those things that you're going to have to experiment with. And maybe what you'd want to do is on the pull compensation on this, take this down to, I don't know. You might want to play with that a little bit as well. Hey, where was the starting and stop points on here, by the way? Reshape. Oh, it's starting right here in the middle. Kind of funny, and ending in the middle. How about if we have it go from left to right? Sometimes you get a better ending on a line like this when it is a little ways in from the end, but I'm just going to pop it on over. I think that might make a difference. Details, details, details. Number 1, stabilizing this properly, really sticking this baby down onto that stabilizer is number 1. Playing with those stitch angles, number 2. Spacing on letterings, number 3. Number 4, taking a real look at the proportions of things and where might something, even though it might not be as realistic to the original envelope, you might just want to make things a little bit bigger just so that they're a little more pronounced. And make sure that all these starting and stop points are, stitching in logical ways. And also another thing here is your thread cutter on your machine. I noticed in your original design that I seem to see a little bit of, little tails coming out here and there. So sometimes, even though our sewing machines can cut the threads, trim the threads in between objects, there are times when I'm actually embroidering something like this where it's jumping from one object to another object to another object. I actually turn my thread cutter off and use my little teeny tiny thread snips after the embroidery is done and trim my own little threads rather than the machine trimming them. Sometimes I just get neater starting and end points. I think I've chattered on and on and on long enough, and hopefully some of the things that I've had to say about your cute design are going to be helpful. So good luck with it, and thanks for watching the video. Bye-bye for now.